I'd like to introduce Don. So Don is the B-Qual Director and Program Manager of the Australian Honey Assurance Program. He's come today to speak with us about this project, including the creation of an Australian honey library, flora database, and the honey traceability. So welcome, Don.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you, members of the Yarra Valley Bee Club, to allow me to come and speak this afternoon. I'll start off by doing two things you should never do when you're going to give an address. The first is to apologise. I had the heaviest hay fever attack in years this morning. I've taken about 3 Phenergan. If I go to sleep, someone yell out and wake me up. And I apologise for my rather snuffled, muffled voice and watery eyes. So I hope you put up with me. B-Qual, as you all know, or hopefully will know, B-Qual is owned by the Australian Honey Industry Council, ARBEC. We are an independent company. ARBEC are our only shareholder, and we have 5 directors. Currently, we have 2 from Queensland, 2 from New South Wales, and 1 from Victoria. The day-to-day operations of B-Qual are managed by AusQual, which is a division of AusMeats. And we set the standards for quality assurance and food handling for the Australian honey industry. It's a hazard and critical control points program. It provides businesses with product integrity, quality assurance, and regulatory compliance. Now, B-Qual is the standard that is audited, and all of our auditors employed by AusMeats are global exemplar. So it's a very high standard that we audit to. And the aim of B-Qual is that we aim to ensure that 90% of the Australian honey is quality assured and meets all the expectations of export and the EU export requirements as well. So we believe that the adoption of these B-Qual standards does give a higher quality of assurance to our clients in the honey industry. So that's very quickly who we are at B-Qual. Now, I'll just go to our slideshow. As I said, we're owned by ARBEC, and a part of our brief is that we inform industry and the wider community on the status of the Australian honey industry. Now, some time ago, about 18 months or so ago, we had some claims of honey adulteration made by reporters in the press and ABC. Those claims made were based on NMR, nuclear magnetic resonance testing. Now, NMR, although it's a very precise and a very accurate testing method, is not yet sophisticated enough to judge honey. It's a very precise, as I said. If that pen I hold up, if I had 2 of those pens, this is a very simple example of where NMR is. If I have 2 biros identical, yet when the man makes the second pen, he puts a touch more white ink into that plastic casing, that will show up as an adulterated or a different pen. So there's no variation in NMR to accept it. Now, when NMR and Booker did those tests in Germany, they only had a very small Australian database. In Australia, we have around about 800 to 900 eucalypt varieties. Europe has 8, of which 6 of those are in Spain. Now, Brooker had some Australian honey from a test we sent off about 3 years ago to them to test some honey. They used that without our authority, but the fact is that we had a client or a person in Australia sent 24 samples of honey over to Europe. And those honeys were made up of blends of honey. The one that got most of the bad publicity was the Capilano Alauli brand. They also tested Bramwell and other brands. It turned out, after investigation by ARBIC, ourselves, and the ACCC, that no 100% claimed Australian honey was actually tested. So obviously, when they tested our Australian honey, it all came up as adulterated. I think Manuka honey out of New Zealand was 100% adulterated, simply because there was no database there of the Australian honey. So we had no proof at that time of what the NMR testing was showing. We had no proof to counteract that. So that left the industry in a very bad situation. They even tested, one of the tests they sent across was a native bee honey out of Queensland, which is certainly not a mainstream honey product in Australia. So we all remember the headlines: the fake honey scandal widens, fake honey scandal being sold in Australia, 1 in 5 Australian honey samples were adulterated. Fake honey imports could lead to a humanitarian disaster. So the industry got a lot of bad publicity, which was effectively based on an unproven, an untried trial system, and we had no basis to counteract those statements. So that led the B-Qual board to consider the question of how can we develop an Australian honey library and a database consistent with all of our varieties of honey to counteract any such claims in the future. So we sat down and prepared a business plan for the Australian government, and we were awarded $209,000 earlier this year to develop an Australian honey library. Now, the library is an initiative between B-Qual in collaboration with the CRC Honeybee Products and the University of WA. And it was made possible by the federal government grant of $209,000. In addition to this library, B-Qual had already started last year to digitise our system to assist to deliver an auditable and digitised traceability system. Now, we're fairly well advanced with that part of the program, and in fact, next month we will be trial testing the first of our digitised system with some beekeepers in WA and in Tasmania. That will tie in nicely to the honey library, which we believe from the format that we've worked up will be the largest honey library in the world, and will be the only honey library that will be as detailed as ours to the extent of the chemistry and the honey paleontology and the DNA mapping that will be included in that library. So the library is not just getting 150 or 200 or 300 or 400 bottles of honey from various parts of Australia, banging them on a shelf and say, well, that's the Australian Honey Library. The library eventually will build to somewhere around about 7,000 varietal samples of honey throughout Australia from 3 biographical regions. So why do we need the honey library? Well, first off, honey is the world's 3rd most adulterated food after milk and olive oil. So it's essential that we rule Australian honey out of that mix. I've just got down there, don't knock the big players. One of the problems that we have is that we're a disjointed industry. We have 1,800 odd commercial beekeepers, and we have around about 25,000 recreational beekeepers. And we're like that big dysfunctional family. We don't always talk to each other. The recreational beekeepers, perhaps at times, are a little bit hard, we think, on the commercial beekeepers. And the beekeepers, the commercial guys, perhaps don't always realise the input that the recreational people can put into the industry. So we're trying to bring the groups together a little bit. I know when I go to some clubs and I talk, I hear all the stories that the recreational people bring out about, oh, the big fellas in the supermarkets mix their honey, they overheat it, it's not as good as this honey. Well, you know, we all produce good honey. Recreational people produce good honey. Commercial people produce good honey. The big packers produce good honey. It doesn't help the industry generally if we have people denigrating each other's brand or each other's variety of honey. So we need to work together to improve the industry. We need to work together to improve the confidence of our consumers in our honey products. So we need the recreational and the commercial beekeepers to work together for the industry benefit. We certainly don't want to have one group fighting the other group. I've been to farmers markets and I've seen a jar of honey with a fly in it being sold by a fairly small beekeeper. I don't see flies in jars of honey produced by Beechworth or Capilano. So we all can have faults, we can all make mistakes, but the thing is that we must, as an industry, work together, and I can't stress that enough. Today, Mexico's Ministry of Rural Development estimate that 4 out of 5 jars of honey sold in Mexico are adulterated. In Europe and America, it is estimated that 20 to 25% of total honey sales are adulterated. So the dollar value is extraordinarily high. It's certainly in the many millions of dollars, if not billions. And in fact, only a week or so ago, a European researcher put out a paper saying that he believed that the adulterated honey sales throughout the world about equaled the black market arms market in terms of dollar value. I think that's a little high, but certainly it's a major problem for our industry. So hence the importance of creating a position of importance for Australian honey. Now, currently, we use throughout the world isotope carbon sugar testing, which is known as C3 and C4. The C3 and C4 test is the only test approved throughout the world by all countries and authorities as the carbon sugar level of testing for honey. No other test is accepted worldwide other than those 3. So the push for NMR, and there's no doubt that NMR may well have some benefit to us. And in fact, a part of our honey library test is that we are going to look at a proper database for NMR to see how it does compare. But currently, the C3 and the C4 are the only tests that we can use at this time. So we produce around about 30,000 tonnes of honey a year, mainly from the 1,800 commercial beekeepers in Australia, and about 5% of our honey is actually tested at the packing level. So how would a library work? Before we can actually go out and collect a whole lot of samples from all over Australia, we have to develop the process to begin to build the library. We need the data to be used to verifying adulterated honeys and eventually for honey provenance claim cases concerning Australian honey. So the long-term object is to build data around the various Australian honeys. That data can then be used internationally to verify the provenance of Australian honey. The second stage is that we'll need to include processes within the B-Qual quality assurance system to further collect datability and tracing datability. So we need to improve the responsiveness of the data available from our system. And thirdly, we need to improve the awareness of anti-counterfeiting packaging options available to honey packers. And that'll minimise the adulteration of our honey within our export market. So the grant is for a 2-year program. The initial objectives will be to develop the processes, and that's becoming a lot harder than we thought. We started the honey library program in July, and we're now near enough to October, and we're still developing those processes. We have to talk to virtually every data laboratory or testing laboratory in Australia. We only want NATA registered people, and we need then to get all those people on board with the single testing regimes. We need to include the processes with our existing quality assurance system, and we need to improve the awareness of the anti-counterfeiting packaging options. So there's a terrific amount of work to be done before we even start to fill honey into bottles. But once we get through that, I guess, process development stage, and we are making progress, but it is slow. And as you can imagine, if you've got about 50 different scientists all running around, they all want to have their own way. So it's quite a large case in tying it all together to say, well, this is our program, this is our track we're going to take, this is the process we're going to follow, and have everyone agree to it. But the first part, once we get through that, and I'm like to think we're probably about 85% of the way through that process now with the laboratories, we'll need to develop the floral database. Now, luckily, we've had some luck here as well. Dr. Brian Burruth from the WA, University of WA, has agreed to extend the melliferous flora database from Western Australia to the whole of Australia to document the current dominant nectar sources in each biogeographical area. Now, the database will need continuous updating as we deal with fire, drought, land use, climate change, and so forth. Linked to this system is the palynology, or the pollen identification, which will associate the honey to the biogeographical regions. Now, we've again had some recent advances supported by AgriFutures, and Professor Kyle Snyderman from the University of Melbourne has done a fair bit of work on pollen palynology, and he has agreed for some of that data to be given to us to build into our program. And again, Dr. Lynn Milne from the Chemistry Centre in WA has also donated a lot of her work to us as well. So the CRC with B-Qual is working on an alternative artificial intelligence system, and we have a group of engineers in the University of WA for the quick assessment of pollen numbers. So we are really getting, for the first time in a long time, a lot of these scientists, a lot of these researchers who are doing work, we're trying to bring that work into one box, into one area. And the amount of help we are getting from these people is quite amazing. And I think for the first time, we're going to see the benefits of having a lot of research, because Australia does do a lot of research in honeybee populations, on floral databases, on honey research. We do a lot of research, but it's never been tied into one source. So you've got 25 different researchers all doing 25 different programs. They'll come up with 25 different results, and that's where it stops. So what we're trying to do now is to say, right, all your researchers, give us the data you can, and we'll put it into one big bowl. And for once, we're starting to get somewhere. And the B-Qual digitisation will be a very easy system for beekeepers from the site to enter data, which will again give us that just a little bit extra of on-site field technology. So once we've got the research battened down and we've got all these researchers working in the one direction, we can then commence working on the honey library. And then with the new season's honey now beginning, we hope within the next few weeks to trial a web app which will register new samples, and hopefully by early next year, perhaps about March, we will be inviting beekeepers to donate samples of honey for the Australian Honey Library. We'll be looking to get 500 mils or half a kilo from beekeepers from all over Australia. Now, once we've got those samples up and stored, and that's another problem on its own, because we need to have 3 separate storage areas in Australia due to the biosecurity and various state legislations. So we'll have one collection centre in WA. We will have one collection centre on the East Coast, and we'll have one collection centre somewhere in probably Tasmania. The collection centres will be secure, and we are currently in negotiation with the NMI, the National Measurement Institute, which is a government department, for them to actually handle or hold the honey library on our behalf. Because it's not just the physical storage of the jars of honey, which there'll be anything up to 9,000 of those, but there's all the data to each of that honey being tied as well. Now, the database will be secure. We know that will be held by a government department, whether it be the NMI or another government department. We know that one of them has agreed to hold it, but we just need to get a few technicalities out of the way first. But the database will be secure because that database is going to hold people's names, it's going to hold the geographical regions the honey came from, it's going to hold the DNA of that honey, it's going to hold the GPS locations of where the honey came from. A whole lot of data will be stored. Now, they will only be accessed by 2 or 3 people Australia-wide who can have access to that database. NMI will store it on their secure government web or server, but it'll be handled and managed and owned by B-Qual. And we have to set up a protocol where we can guarantee to all of those participants that this honey is safe. So at the moment, we're looking along the lines of perhaps 2 people only at any one time authorised to access the database, and then possibly to then work out some sub-levels that we can give to researchers for them to continue on. So it's quite an involved process. Parts B and C will be to investigate the alternative analytical systems. Now, as I said earlier, we're not happy with the way that NMR handled the response at 18 months or 2 years ago, but we acknowledge that NMR is a testing method that we at least have to look at. So we've allocated some money to have Brooker do some pilot studies for us on yellow box and probably something like a river red gum, just 2 fairly basic ordinary honeys. And we'll develop a small database of those honeys before the testing is done. The other thing that we're trying to do is to look at other quick analytical tests to be developed to look for correlations with the more intensive methods, such as high performance fin laser chromatography and different spectroscopy systems. Hopefully, they'll become a cost-effective test. We want to get a test, what we call a bench test, down to something around about $30 to $35, because every jar has to be tested. Every jar has to have that certain amount of data built up around it. Now, we believe that we can get a test that will be acceptable to the EU, the Food Standard of Australia, Codex and everyone else for around about $35 per test. I know myself and Liz Barber, Dr. Liz Barber from the CRC, are currently in negotiations with all state governments to help the states, or to get the states to help us establish linkages to accelerate the delivery of the analytical testing methods. So it's important that we have each state government first off agreeing to the set tests we want to do, because if the states agree to it, then it's easier to get the federal government to agree to it. So unfortunately, a part of the job at the moment is politics, playing in the arena to get all these people on board. But I have to say, even with all the other problems with governments at the moment, we are getting tremendous reception, tremendous amount of help from every government department regarding our project. And we've already had 2 states agree in principle to sign up to us, and that'll be an expenditure of, from their part, of about $100,000 each year for the next 2 or 3 years. So we really do have the industry on the front page with a lot of the government departments. Our current federal government agricultural minister, Mr. Littleproud, and his predecessor, not predecessor, but Senator Mackenzie before him, were both champions of the honey industry in Australia. They were really great supporters of it, and luckily now Littleproud's there, that's following on. Now, the 3 biogeographical areas we have is WA is one area on its own. South Australia and the East Coast is one area, and Tasmania the third. The reason for that is that WA has unique honeys in Yarra and Yarra honeys. Tasmania, of course, has leatherwood and manuka, and the East Coast has a range of other honeys like yellow box, blue gum in South Australia and so forth. So they're the 3 biogeographical areas, and there'll be a collection point in each of those states for the library. So how's it all going to work? Well, stage 1 is with establishing a database specification document for the honey chemistry in relation to the domestic and international requirements. This has well proceeded, and only for the goodwill of researchers like Snyderman and Burruff and other people, we've got a lot of that data, which we thought initially we'd have to do ourselves, we've had access to. So that has saved us a lot of time and a lot of money. We are well along the way of developing storage sites for the samples. The storage requirements are that we need to store in any one area up to around about, well, we're saying up to perhaps in total about 8,000 jars in each state, maybe up to 10,000 jars in each state. And it has to be stored at 16 degrees. It has to be in a secure area, and it has to, again, have limited access for people. No, we just can't have every Tom, Dick and Harry walking into a big tool room. So we do have to have some fairly stringent security around it. And that's why we're talking to NMI or the CSIRO. We then have to develop the digital dictionary for the Australian Honey Library to connect to B-Qual. Again, that has started. We've got our digitisation program underway, and we are probably at this stage about 90% down the track of digitising B-Qual. Our software writers say that once we've got the dictionary done up, it will be a very simple job to transmove that across into B-Qual. So hopefully that'll work well. And at the end of the project, in about 2 years' time, we'll be conducting throughout Australia a series of anti-counterfeiting packaging workshops. And that'll be to basically to train people in modern labelling, labelling to show them how to label without overstating, and to make sure that they fully understand the labelling laws of Australia at the time. Now we need to develop the test methods, and I said that's progressing. That's probably the hardest part of the whole journey, is to get everyone on board. We can only use NATA approved laboratories, because if it ever goes to court, we want to have a single standard that we can base our cases on. We need to document the industry processes, because we do want to develop at the end of it an Australian batch number system. And the ABNS, the batch numbering system, is there, but once a beekeeper, Andrew Wooten, can go out to Marysville somewhere and have his yellow box, if he wants to come in and have it tested on a bench test for, and hopefully around $30, and that conforms with the standard that we have for that yellow box honey, he will then be given an Australian batch number. Now that'll go onto an NFT card or a QR code or something that he can use on his label, and that will then tie all that honey back to that provenance of where it came from, when it was taken from the hive, who's processed it, when he bottled it, right up so the client can get a really good picture of their honey. We need to to train our B-Qual members for changes. I'm sure you'll all agree that we are an old industry. I think the average age of a beekeeper in Australia, commercial beekeeper, is around about 59 years of age now. So change doesn't come easily, and particularly change when it comes to digital or to databases and chemistry, mate, it's a hard job. So we will need to be running a lot of courses with our B-Qual members to bring them along with these changes and to make them aware of just how important the quality assurance system and the processes are. And as the program evolves, we'll keep the industry informed. During the program, we'll be calling on beekeepers to participate at various stages. Now, it's not all going to be commercial beekeepers. We'll be calling on the amateur beekeepers, particularly in those inner regions, to give us samples. And we hope that we will be able, as we get through each of our stages, about every 3 months, we have to lodge an activity plan with the government. At that stage, once that activity plan is approved, we hope to post that on the website. So that'll give the industry a good feel as to how we're progressing with this project, because if it goes as we plan it to go, if it ends up as even at 90% of what we think it can, the potential will be, it will be the world's best honey library. It'll be the best honey library on the planet, and it'll be the only honey library that'll be totally tied up with the DNA and the honey testing and the pollen palynology. So we really do have an opportunity of putting Australia on the map as far as honey research goes. We have a good reputation now for research, but if that can be backed up with factual things like this honey library, no country in the world would be better placed than us to do it. I mean, we're the only country that don't have Varroa, so therefore we don't have chemicals. So we've got a mighty start on most other countries anyway. So if we can pull this off, have the honey library to where we want it to be, It's something that will benefit the industry, not just for the next 5 years or the next 10 years. It'll benefit the industry for many, many, many years to come. And it'll make Australia probably the world's leading research company for honey anywhere in the world. Now, we'll be putting updates on our website regularly, so we invite you to go and have a look at B-Qual, www.beequal.com.au. You can email me through B-Qual audits or personally to myself, Don H. Muir at Optusnet, and I'll be more than happy to take any suggestions, questions or answers, but probably at the stage we're at the moment, we prefer to have suggestions rather than questions, but we'll be more than happy to involve the general public in this honey library project, because we think it's an exciting project and we think it's a project that just has tremendous benefit for the industry as a whole. So it's a pretty dry old topic to talk about, but I'm more than happy if we have time to take any questions or suggestions you may have. And thank you for your time and thank you for your patience in listening to me in a clogged up voice and talking about a pretty dry old subject. But
oh, that was fantastic, Don.
Appreciate your time.
Thanks so much for sharing that. That's really fascinating. There's actually a couple of questions that have come through. Oh, sorry, it's just scrolled down. You mentioned Brooker.
Yes.
And also the MMR. Can you tell us what both of those stand for?
Yes, well, NMR is magnetic resonance testing. It's a testing method. It's used, and look, it's been used extensively, particularly in the milk and the olive oil industry. Now, milk and olive oil, of course, don't have as many varieties of honey. But NMR, as I said before, you've got to have a database exactly the same as that you are testing. So it goes into the machine. If you put a jar of yellow box honey into that machine from, say, Warburton, and then I get a jar of yellow box from Wagga in a dry area, that honey, the pollen, the DNA of that honey will be slightly different. Both yellow box, both off the same eucalypt tree, but it'll be slightly different. Now, the one that's being tested, that your sample base remains stable. But if I get my Wagga honey, my Wagga yellow box, and I know it's perfect honey because I've taken it off the hive myself, I haven't adulterated it, I put it in a clean jar, it is pure honey off the tree. But if I put that in against the database one, it won't show up the same. It'll show up as different. Now, it does show up as different, it'll just show up as adulterated. So NMR does not have, at this stage for honey, the ability to say, oh, look, this is yellow box, but it's got a little bit more glucose or a bit more sucrose, or it's got something else in it. It just says, no, that's not the same as the database, therefore it is adulterated. And that's what happened with the testing early, because they were basically testing oranges and apples as far as we were concerned. Brooker are the company who developed, or are the main leaders of NMR testing in Germany. Now, the Brooker Institute is well known, very well respected, they're great, but we have found perhaps their way of doing business is a little different to ours. About 5 years ago, through ARBIC, we sent some samples over to Brooker for testing, just trial testing. We got a report back from them, but a stipulation of our sending those samples over was that this honey and these data results belong to ARBIC. They are not for general release to anyone else. And since then, we've found, of course, Brooker have used that honey in their pursuit of getting NMR testing approved. And in fact, when Costa sent his honey over 18 months or so ago, Brooker actually referred to some of that Australian honey that we'd sent over previously. So we got a little bit upset with them, and we had a discussion with them, and we've been assured it won't happen again. But NMR is the testing method, like X-ray, it's nuclear magnetic resonance testing. It is a very finite type of test. It is black on black. There can't be a little bit of grey or white in there to get variation. With the C3 and the C4 sugar tests, people say, yes, it's an old-fashioned test and we have to get more done than just use that. We can't just use C3 and C4 because, like all testing, the cheats are always ahead of your testing. So as I said, we're trying to improve the C3 and C4 test, but NMR, I think, has a long, long way to go before it can be accepted as a legitimate test for honey. And in fact, I think that's borne out by the fact that no country in the world, no government in the world accepts NMR solely as a test method.
Yeah, thanks, Don. There's also another question. Is each honey sample duplicated in each of the 3 centres of collection? So WA.
Well, look, it could well be, because if you get a yellow box, for instance, yes, it might be duplicated, but we're not worried about that because the duplication, we don't know for sure how different chemically yellow box from South Australia is to yellow box in Victoria. We don't know how different the Manuka in Tassie is from some of the Manukas along the mid-north coast of New South Wales. So yes, there will be repetition, there'll be double ups, but we want that because each sample will be defined by a GPS location. And so we'll then learn that, oh, gee whiz, yellow box out of Marysville or Healesville is not the yellow box out of Port Stephens. So we want to get that variation. We want to collect as many samples as we can of all honeys from all areas. And if we ended up with 100,000 jars of honey, that's not going to worry us.
Yeah, that's great. There's one more. Will this make the definition of a honey style more strict, like e.g. yellow box versus yellow box blend?
It won't. For the public, no, it won't. What will happen is that each honey will have an Australian batch number. So if you get a honey 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it's a yellow box, and there's another one, another yellow box from somewhere else, might be 7, 8, 9, 10 or whatever. We'll be able to differentiate them, but it won't really matter to us because it all goes back to the number. So all the customer will get in the end is a number, and that'll be yellow box. But it might be, yellow box might have 50 different numbers.
Yeah, that's right. Don, thank you so much for today. Does anyone else have any questions that they would like to ask Don? You're welcome to unmute and ask him. No?
How long do the samples in storage last?
Well, I won't be here when they'll last for, look, we're kind of saying, when we're talking to the NMI and these people, we say, we want storage space for 50 years. But hopefully at the end of 49 years, someone will come along and say, oh, we better keep this thing going and keep it going a bit longer. But we need it to run on basically indefinitely. And I'd like to think it can run indefinitely.
And what happens if you detect adulteration? That's a question from Andrew.
Well, that will be a case of, we'll go back to that beekeeper and we'll check his processes. Now, the first samples we are going to get are going to be just purely from B-Qual members because they are audited. So we can verify where that honey's come from and how it's been treated. But as we go along and we get samples from Bev and John or Kim and Capdoors or someone, and if it comes back and through our ring tests we find that there's something a little strange, we'll ring up Bev or John and say, hey, how did you get this honey? Where did it come from and how did you treat it? So we'll kind of do a desk audit on them and ask them for another sample. And then if we get that sample and it still comes back as something that doesn't look quite right, then we'll probably go out and see John and Bev and have a bit of a chat and see how they're doing it. Or it might just be they've got another strain of honey we didn't know about. We don't know. Yeah, so it'll be a case of, initially we want to get a set of standards up that we can audit those samples when they come in. So we just don't want to have 1 million samples turn up on our doorstep.
Yeah.
We want to know first off that they have been audited and they've gone through the correct biosecurity and the correct extraction and processing.
Yeah.
Will you be checking for diseases as well?
No, it won't be a foremost thing. No, we won't. We're checking purely for the paleontology of the honey and the pollen and the chemistry of the honey. All we want is to know how many Australian honeys we have, get the DNA of that honey, get the DNA of the pollen, and list that as a testing, as a standard. Disease and beekeeping is something that belongs a problem to someone else. Yeah.
Don, thank you so much for today. I'm sure
Thank you.
we'll be very keen on sending in our samples when you're ready.
Well, you will be getting an email from us at some stage, but not until probably into the latter part of next year, possibly. But thank you for your time and the opportunity to talk about it.
Thank you very much. You're welcome. You're welcome to stay on, but we just want to join and say thank you so much for coming. That was really interesting. Thank you.